March 3rd, 1943. The Bismarck Sea is a blur of grey water rushing past, just 50 feet below the cockpit glass. Inside the B-25 Mitchell bomber, the vibration is already deafening, but the pilot isn't looking at a bomb site. He is looking through a simple iron ring mounted on the dashboard, lining up the bridge of a Japanese destroyer, looming rapidly in the windshield. He squeezes the trigger. Instantly, the bomber shudders violently, slowing in midair as if hitting a brick wall. 10 forward-facing .50 caliber machine guns erupt simultaneously, spitting 75 rounds every second. The sound is not a rattle. It is a continuous tearing roar, a buzzsaw that drowns out the twin Wright Cyclone engines. On the Japanese ship, there is no time to return fire. The deck plates, the anti-aircraft crews, and the bridge simply disintegrate into a mist of red spray and twisted steel. This weapon system has just changed the physics of the Pacific War. Yet only months prior, the aviation experts had declared that this plane would never fly. By the early months of 1942, the Pacific Ocean had effectively become a Japanese lake. The Imperial Japanese Navy, undefeated and operating with terrifying efficiency, had swept across Southeast Asia, crushing Allied resistance in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. To the American commanders looking at the situation map in Melbourne, the red tide of conquest was not just advancing, it was accelerating. The ultimate prize for Tokyo was not just an island chain, but the isolation and eventual neutralization of Australia. The last line of defense for the Australian continent was the rugged, jungle-choked island of New Guinea. Specifically, the Allied hold on Port Moresby on the southern coast. If Moresby fell, Japanese bombers would be within range of the Australian mainland, and the supply lines from the United States would be severed. The Japanese High Command knew this, and they began pouring troops, supplies, and heavy equipment into their beachheads at Lae and Salamaua on the northern coast of the island. To stop them, the Allies had to sever the shipping lanes bringing these reinforcements. This necessity exposed a catastrophic flaw in American air power doctrine. For decades, the United States Army Air Forces had bet their future on a specific concept: high-altitude precision bombing. The theory was elegant. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress, equipped with the top-secret Norden bomb sight, would fly at 25 or 30,000 feet, well above the effective range of most enemy flak. From this godlike height, they would drop heavy ordnance into a pickle barrel. It was a strategy designed for the industrial factories of Germany, where targets were stationary and spread across acres of land. In the chaotic waters of the Solomon Sea, however, the theory collapsed. Pilots were ordered to attack maneuvering Japanese destroyers and troop transports from altitudes where the ships looked like matchsticks. A bomb released from 30,000 feet took nearly a minute to fall. In that time, a Japanese captain could simply look up, see the bomb bay doors open, order a hard rudder turn, and watch the bombs explode harmlessly in the open ocean, hundreds of yards away. The statistics were damning. In the first 8 months of the war, high-level bombing attacks against maneuvering ships yielded a hit rate of less than 1%. American crews would return to base exhausted, their aircraft riddled with interceptor fire, having achieved absolutely nothing. The Japanese Navy began to treat these high-altitude raids with derision. They did not fear the B-17. They maneuvered around it. Compounding the failure was the equipment available to the medium bomber groups. The third bomb group, operating out of Charters Towers and Port Moresby, was flying the B-25 Mitchell. In its factory configuration, the B-25 was a standard medium bomber. It had a glass nose compartment where a bombardier sat, hunched over his sight, protected only by plexiglass and a single flexible .30 caliber machine gun that was prone to jamming. It was a design intended for level bombing runs over Europe, not for scraping the wave tops in the South Pacific. The pilots knew that flying straight and level to drop bombs made them sitting ducks for the lethal Japanese Zero fighters. They also knew that the single .30 caliber gun in the nose was roughly as effective as a pea shooter against a hardened warship. Morale plummeted. The crews were flying obsolete tactics with inadequate machines against an enemy that possessed superior speed, better maneuverability, and a seeming invulnerability to American air power. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Southwest Pacific area, demanded results. He needed the Japanese convoys stopped before they could reinforce their garrisons for a ground assault on Port Moresby. But the 5th Air Force, under its current leadership, had no answer. They continued to order high-altitude drops, and the Japanese convoys continued to dock at Lae, unloading thousands of troops who would soon be killing Australians on the Kokoda track. The war in the air was being lost not for lack of courage, but for lack of imagination. The deadlock required a shattering of convention. It required a shift from the pristine theories of the War College to the dirty, improvised realities of jungle warfare. The force needed a commander who didn't care about regulations, and an engineer who didn't care about the laws of aerodynamics. In August 1942, the stagnation broke. General George Kenney arrived in Australia to take command of the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenney was a short, abrasive, and highly unconventional officer who carried a deep disdain for the bomber mafia and their obsession with high-altitude precision. He looked at the dismal hit rates and the low morale of his crews and immediately began firing commanders who offered excuses instead of solutions. Kenney didn't want parade ground discipline. He wanted pirates. And in the hangars of the 3rd Bomb Group, he found the ultimate pirate. Major Paul Irvin Gunn, universally known as Pappy, was not a typical Army officer. At 42 years old, he was nearly twice the age of the pilots he flew with. Before the war, he had been the operations manager for Philippine Airlines, living a comfortable life in Manila with his wife and 4 children. When the Japanese invaded in December 1941, the U.S. Army absorbed him and his fleet of civilian aircraft into the transport service. Gunn flew daring rescue missions until the very end, pulling personnel out of the crumbling Philippines even as Japanese fighters hunted him down. But on January 2nd, 1942, the trap snapped shut. The Japanese army entered Manila, capturing Gunn's wife and children. They were imprisoned in the Santo Tomas internment camp, where they faced starvation and disease. Pappy Gunn escaped to Australia, but he arrived as a man possessed. He wasn't fighting for a flag or a strategic map. He was fighting to clear a path back to his family. The rage inside him made him indifferent to military bureaucracy. He didn't care about technical manuals or safety protocols. He wanted to kill Japanese invaders, and he wanted a plane that could do it efficiently. Kenney and Gunn were kindred spirits. When Kenney inspected the B-25s, he saw the same flaw Gunn had been complaining about: the glass nose. It was dead weight. In a low-level fight, a bombardier was useless. What the plane needed was not a man looking through a telescope, but a battery of guns clearing the deck of the enemy ship. The concept was strafing. If a bomber came in at mast height, 50 feet off the water, it could release its bomb so they skipped across the surface like stones on a pond, slamming directly into the side of the ship. It was a lethal technique, but it had a suicidal drawback. Approaching a destroyer at 50 feet meant flying straight into the teeth of its anti-aircraft fire. To survive the run, the bomber needed enough forward firepower to suppress those enemy gunners, to kill them before they could kill the plane. Standard doctrine said you couldn't put heavy guns in the nose of a B-25. The recoil would shear the rivets. The weight would make the plane nose-heavy and unflyable. The center of gravity would shift so drastically that the pilot wouldn't be able to pull out of a dive. Pappy Gunn told Kenny he didn't care about the physics. He asked for permission to take a B-25 off the line and tinker with it. Kenny, desperate for a weapon that actually worked, gave him the green light. He unleashed the mad mechanic on the U.S. Army's inventory, unknowingly initiating one of the most radical field modifications in the history of aerial warfare. The transformation began in a sweltering hangar in Brisbane, far removed from the sterile design offices of North American Aviation in California. Pappy Gunn didn't have blueprints or wind tunnel data. He had a welding torch, a pile of scrap metal, and a scavenger's genius. The first step was an act of desecration. Gunn ordered his mechanics to rip out the bombardier's station, the very heart of the B-25's design purpose. The Norden bomb sight, a device classified as secret and worth thousands of dollars, was unbolted and tossed aside. In its place, Gunn envisioned a solid wall of firepower. He scavenged .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns from wrecked fighters and supply depots. His plan was to mount 4 of them directly into the nose cone, but simply bolting guns to the frame wasn't enough. The recoil force of a single .50 caliber round is substantial. 4 firing in unison generates enough kinetic energy to slow the aircraft in mid-flight. There was a genuine fear that the vibration would shatter the glass cockpit or shear the nose section right off the fuselage. Gunn engineered a steel cradle to hold the guns, reinforcing the floor of the nose with heavy plating to absorb the shock. But he didn't stop there. He wanted more. He looked at the sides of the fuselage just below the cockpit window and decided to bolt on blister packs, pods containing 2 more guns on each side. A visiting field representative from North American Aviation was horrified. He watched Gunn drilling holes into the stressed skin of the bomber and warned him that he was destroying the aircraft's center of gravity. He argued that the nose would be too heavy, that the landing gear would collapse, and that the plane would likely lawn dart into the runway upon takeoff. Pappy Gunn didn't stop drilling. He replied in colorful language that the representative could stand back or get welded to the fuselage. Gunn knew the theoretical limits, but he also knew the reality of the target. He wasn't building a plane to fly smoothly. He was building a plane to kill destroyers. He loaded the nose with ammo boxes, running chutes through the crawlway where the bombardier used to crawl. When the dust settled, the Commerce destroyer sat on the tarmac, bristling with 8 forward-firing heavy machine guns. It looked ungainly, nose-heavy, and brutish. It was no longer a bomber. It was a flying gun battery. To understand why Gunn's paperweight nose was genius rather than madness, one must understand the specific tactic it was designed to facilitate. It was called skip bombing, a technique refined by Major Bill Benn, but one that was practically suicidal without Gunn's modification. The concept relied on a pilot flying at 200 miles per hour, barely 50 feet above the waves, mast height. At the precise moment, he would release a bomb with a 5-second delay fuse. The bomb would hit the water, skip like a flat stone across a pond, and slam directly into the side of the enemy ship's hull, detonating below the waterline for a catastrophic kill. The physics of skip bombing were sound, but the tactical reality was terrifying. To line up the shot, a bomber had to fly straight and level directly toward a Japanese destroyer for several miles. In a standard B-25, this meant flying directly into a wall of anti-aircraft fire with only a single jamming nose gun for protection. It was a mathematically perfect way to get shot down. This was the problem Pappy Gunn solved. His buzzsaw wasn't just about inflicting damage, it was about suppression. When Gunn took the prototype up for its first live fire test, the skeptics held their breath. He lined up on a target hulk, a shipwreck off the coast of New Guinea. As he closed the range, he triggered the solenoid. The recoil slowed the B-25 by nearly 10 knots instantly. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of cordite. The floorboards rattled so violently it felt as if the rivets were popping, but the nose stayed on. Downrange, the effect was apocalyptic. The target didn't just take hits, it was enveloped in a churning cloud of water and debris. The concentration of fire from 8.50 caliber machine guns created a beaten zone where nothing biological could survive. Against a Japanese destroyer, this meant that in the critical seconds before the bomber released its payload, the enemy deck crews, the men manning the anti-aircraft guns, would be turned into red mist. The B-25 didn't have to dodge the flak. It silenced the source. When Gunn landed and taxied back, the skepticism vanished. The pilots of the third bomb group looked at the jagged holes in the target and realized the dynamic of the war had shifted. They were no longer high-altitude spectators hoping for a lucky hit. They were apex predators. They affectionately dubbed the new B-25 the Commerce Destroyer. General Kenny ordered the modification for every available B-25 in the theater. The hangars in Brisbane turned into 24-hour assembly lines. Gunn worked himself to exhaustion, supervising the conversion of an entire squadron. They were racing against time. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were gathering a massive convoy at Rabaul, 8 transports and 8 destroyers, carrying nearly 7,000 troops. They were heading for the Leh garrison. If they landed, the balance of power in New Guinea would tip back to the Empire. The weapon was ready. Now it needed a target. March 1st, 1943, the Bismarck Sea. A massive convoy, designated Operation 81, pushes through the damp grey mist of the Vitiaz Strait. 8 destroyers flank 8 lumbering transport ships. Inside the holds, nearly 7,000 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army's 51st Division sit in cramped silence, surrounded by drums of aviation fuel and crates of ammunition. Their destination is Leh. If they reach the shore, the Japanese garrison will be revitalized, and the Allied offensive in New Guinea could be stalled for months. For 2 days, thick cloud cover and tropical storms shield the convoy. American reconnaissance planes catch only fleeting glimpses of the wakes in the water. In the Allied operations room, the tension is suffocating. General Kenny knows the convoy is out there, but he cannot strike what he cannot see. He has gambled everything on this interception, massing every available squadron, B-17S, A-20S, RAAF Beaufighters, and the newly modified B-25 Strafers. On the morning of March 3rd, the weather breaks. The tropical storm dissolves, leaving the Bismarck Sea calm and the sky ruthlessly clear. The Japanese convoy is exposed, moving at slow speed, just hours from the safety of Lay's harbor. They are confident. Their combat air patrol of Zero fighters is circling overhead, forming a protective umbrella that has historically been impenetrable. At 10 a.m., the radar on the Japanese flagship Shirayuki picks up a massive formation approaching from the south. It is not a probing raid. It is an execution force. General Kenny has launched over 100 aircraft. High above, P-38 Lightnings tangle with the Zeros, drawing the Japanese fighter cover up into the stratosphere. B-17 Flying Fortresses approach at medium altitude, dropping bombs to force the Japanese ships to break formation. It is a chaotic, multi-layered trap, but the real killing blow is coming from the deck. Dropping down from the clouds, invisible against the dark water, until the last second, come the squadrons of the 5th Air Force. Leading the charge are the modified B-25 Mitchells. The pilots push their yokes forward, diving until their altimeters read less than 200 feet. They are not lining up on a bomb run. They are charging like cavalry. On the bridge of the destroyer Arashio, the captain orders the anti-aircraft crews to open fire. They track the incoming bombers, expecting them to pull up. They do not pull up. They level off at mast height, their noses pointing directly at the ship's command center. The distance closes. 1 mile, half a mile, 500 yards. The Japanese gunners brace for the recoil of their own weapons. Then, the B-25s open fire. The effect is instantaneous and horrific. The 8 forward-firing machine guns on each B-25 converge at a focal point 300 yards ahead of the aircraft. When this cone of fire strikes the Japanese destroyer Arashio, it does not merely puncture the hull. It scythes through the superstructure like a chainsaw through balsa wood. The bridge, where the captain and his officers stand, is hammered by hundreds of armor-piercing rounds in a fraction of a second. Glass, steel, and human bodies are churned into an unrecognizable debris field. On the gun decks, the Japanese crews never have a chance to fire. The buzzsaw creates a spray of metal fragments and high-velocity lead that sweeps the decks clear of life. The suppression is total. The terrifying wall of defensive fire that usually meets American bombers simply ceases to exist. With the enemy gunners liquidated, the B-25 pilots hold their course, closing to within stone-throwing distance. This is the moment for the skip bomb. At 300 miles per hour, the bombers release their 500-pound delayed fuse bombs. The ordnance hits the water with a flat thwack, bouncing once, twice, skipping over the torpedo bulges and slamming squarely into the steel sides of the transports. For a heartbeat, there is only the sound of engines roaring overhead as the bombers pull up hard to clear the masts. Then the delay fuses ignite. The ocean surface erupts. The Japanese transport Kenbu Maru, loaded with aviation fuel, vanishes in a blinding fireball that reaches 1,000 feet into the air. The shock wave is so powerful it buffets the American planes flying above. One by one, the ships of the convoy are broken. Destroyers, their keels snapped by waterline detonations, roll over and slip beneath the oil-slicked waves. Troop transports, packed with thousands of soldiers, become infernos. High above, the Zero fighters try to dive in to save their fleet, but they are bounced by the P-38 Lightnings, or caught in the defensive crossfire of the bomber formations. The coordination is absolute. The B-25s circle back like sharks, conducting run after run. They strafe the lifeboats. They strafe the barges. It is a grim industrial dismantling of an entire army division. By the time the sun begins to dip low over the Huon Gulf, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea has ceased to be a battle. It has become a massacre. The calm waters are choked with wreckage, oil, and the floating remnants of the Japanese 51st Division. Pappy Gunn's mad experiment, the nose-heavy, vibrating, unauthorized gunship, has not just proven its worth. It has annihilated an entire enemy convoy in a single afternoon. As the smoke cleared over the Bismarck Sea, the scale of the devastation became apparent. It was absolute. Of the 16 ships that had departed Rabaul with such confidence, 12 were on the bottom of the ocean. All 8 transport ships, the lifeline for the Japanese army in New Guinea, had been sunk. 4 destroyers lay beside them in the crushing depths. The human cost was staggering. Of the nearly 7,000 seasoned troops of the 51st Division, barely 800 reached Leh, most of them washing ashore without weapons, food, or equipment. They were not reinforcements. They were refugees. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors died in the water, victims of the strafing runs in the shark-infested currents. In Tokyo, the news arrived like a funeral shroud. The Imperial General Headquarters, accustomed to broadcasting victories or managed retreats, had no language for a catastrophe of this magnitude. A Japanese staff officer later described the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a shocking disaster. It was the moment the Japanese Navy realized they had lost control of the air and, consequently, the sea. They would never again attempt to run a large transport convoy to New Guinea. The supply lines were severed. The garrison at Leh was effectively under siege, destined to wither and starve. Back at the Allied base in Port Moresby, the mood was electric. General George Kenney sent a communique to General MacArthur that was uncharacteristically brief. It read, "We have cleaned them out." The skeptics who had mocked the concept of low-level bombing, who had called the modified B-25 a flying brick, were silenced. The proof was not in a wind tunnel report. It was floating in the burning oil of the Huon Gulf. The victory at the Bismarck Sea did more than save New Guinea. It revolutionized the American aviation industry. The reports from the 5th Air Force filtered back to North American aviation in California. The engineers who had once warned Pappy Gunn that his modifications would tear the airframe apart now looked at the combat data with disbelief. The Commerce destroyer had not failed structurally. It had become the most efficient ship-killing platform in the Pacific Theater. North American aviation didn't just accept the modification, they adopted it. The factory lines were retooled. The glass-nosed B-25, the symbol of high-altitude doctrine, was phased out of production for the Pacific. In its place came the B-25J Strafer, a factory-built version of Pappy Gunn's garage invention. It rolled off the assembly line with a solid metal nose housing 8.50 caliber machine guns, just as Gunn had envisioned. The buzzsaw became the standard. Across the Pacific, in every theater of the war, American medium bombers began dropping to the deck. They terrorized Japanese shipping lanes from the Philippines to the coast of China. The doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing against ships was quietly buried at sea. The war had moved to the treetops, and the architect of that shift was a man who had simply wanted a weapon that worked. Pappy Gunn had taken a defensive, vulnerable aircraft and turned it into an offensive juggernaut. He had proven that in the desperation of war, the rulebook is often the first casualty, and sometimes the greatest obstacle to victory. War is often romanticized as a contest of strategy, a chessboard moved by generals in distant rooms. But the reality of the Pacific conflict was far more primal. It was a war defined not by the elegance of the plan, but by the brutality of the execution. The transformation of the B-25, Mitchell stands as the ultimate testament to this truth. The aircraft began its life as a symbol of pre-war optimism, a glass-nosed, high-altitude machine designed for a conflict that followed the rules. It ended the war as a Strafer, a scarred, lead-spitting predator that flew low enough to tear the flags off enemy masts. This evolution was not driven by a committee or a government contract. It was driven by the desperation of men like Pappy Gunn, who realized that the only way to survive the jungle was to become more dangerous than the thing hunting you. Pappy Gunn eventually reunited with his family in Manila in 1945, though the years of internment had left deep scars. His legacy, however, was already written in aluminum and steel. Every B-25J that rolled off the assembly line, every solid nose cone packed with .50 caliber machine guns, was a monument to his refusal to accept the impossible. The buzzsaw did more than vaporize Zeros or sink destroyers. It vaporized the old way of thinking. It proved that in the crucible of total war, the greatest weapon is not the one designed in a laboratory, but the one forged in the field, born from the terrifying necessity of the moment. When the engines finally cut and the smoke cleared over the Bismarck Sea, the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the silence of a new era in aerial warfare, one where there was no place to hide and nowhere left to run.